Kia ora koutou katoa. No mai haere mai ki te Converge ko Arch aho. Good afternoon, evening, and welcome back to our Converge speaker series. My name is Arch. I'm an architect and principal in Warren and Marnie's Auckland studio, and I'm joined by Fiona Short, associate principal and our sustainability group lead, co-hosting from our Christchurch studio, and our speaker Shamubeel Eaqub. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and especially to those who are in lockdown version 2.0 in Auckland. This is the second talk in our series with guest speakers building on the theme of how we respond to the impacts of climate change. And tonight we'll hear an economist's perspective. Tonight's event is about 1 hour long, and that should include about 30 minutes for questions. So please feel free to type those directly into the Q&A section of the Zoom app, and we'll put those to Shamubeel and discuss towards the end. Like the first talk, this will be recorded and available to watch offline later. So I'll now hand over to Fiona to say a few words and introduce our speaker.
Right. Kia ora koutou katoa. Hello everyone. I'm Fiona, and I'm going to quickly run over the story that brings us here today and introduce our special guest and hand over for the presentation. So sustainability to us is more than just about climate change. It's about inspiring people to feel connected to their place so that they feel inclined to protect it. It's about well-being, thriving communities, and highly livable cities. Sustainability to us is about figuring out how we can all have the biggest positive impact on our natural and social environment. So last year, Warren and Marnie were one of the many architecture practices who declared a climate and biodiversity emergency. So the climate has always been a real concern for us. We've been a certified Toitū carbon zero business since 2007, where we measure, manage and reduce our carbon emissions year on year and have achieved reductions in that time. But the emissions of our business are dwarfed when compared to the impact of the projects that we proudly help bring to life. And this is the reality of the work that we do in the built environment. And with this reality, we think comes great responsibility. So recently, informed by global research, we made a commitment to ourselves. So by 2030, our goal with our clients is that all new projects designed by us will be net zero carbon in operation, and also 50% more energy efficient and have 40% less embodied carbon. Now, this is no small task, but we believe it is necessary. We don't know where this decade will take the built environment or our work, but what we do know is this. 1, the answers will be created together. 2, that thinking in silos holds us all back. 3, the current status quo is not our future. And 4, the incremental shifts won't get us where we need to be quickly enough. So put in another way, to generate and accelerate the innovative integrated solutions required to achieve this systematic change, we all need to openly share our knowledge, extend our traditional roles, and become advocates for serious change. So we decided to embark on this adventure by inviting a diverse group of the best and the brightest from a range of sectors and disciplines to share their ideas and expertise on our most complex challenges. For our first webinar, Dr Kate Meyer, Director of the Planetary Accounting Network, introduced the idea of planetary limits and how fair budgets might be determined for countries, sectors, and even projects. Tonight, we'll be asking Shamubeel Eaqub for an economist take on what levers we can pull to shift towards a society living within these planetary limits. What are the most powerful levers that deliver both the required efficiency as well as equity? So Shamubeel is no stranger to the public, but for those of you who have not yet had the pleasure of hearing Shamubeel speak, please let me introduce him. So Shamubeel is an experienced superstar economist who makes economics easy and entertaining. He's a regular and respected media commentator and author, and a thought leader who isn't afraid to take a contrarian view. He has 2 decades of experience as an economist in Wellington, Melbourne and Auckland, in leading international banks and consultancy. We invited Shamubeel to be one of our guest speakers because we need to understand how we can amplify or harness impact through levers outside of the drawing board and conventional sustainable business practices. We hope you can all enjoy and take away something new from this evening's presentation. Shamubeel, we're so glad you accepted our invitation, and we're really excited for you to share your thinking with us tonight. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. When the team at Warren Mahoney asked me to come and talk about this quite a big issue, really. I had to really think about how would I frame it. And so we talked a lot around which bit of the economics do you want to bring in. And in the end, we decided on really kind of thinking about the how of making change. Because I think all of us who are on this call today, we know that we need to make the change, but how do we go about making it happen? So what I'll do tonight over the course of the next sort of 30 minutes is take you through a little bit of my thinking in terms of how we're seeing change take place, what are the big levers, how are the ways we can make sure that the changes that we need to see do actually take place. Economics can only play one part of it. So, this series is very much about bringing in all the different disciplines, all the different perspectives, but hopefully this will give us some clear insights and some clear recommendations in terms of what you can do and what our businesses can do, what our industry can do, and what our politicians can do. So, very deliberately we have the economic in the front because I'm an economist and I want to stay in my lane. Those of you who listened to the presentation, the first Converge presentation, you'd have heard about the planetary limits. And again, this is not something that would be particularly surprising to anybody. We know that we are consuming huge amounts of resources. We are, at the rate that we're going, we are using a huge amount of our natural resources, creating pollutants and all those bits and pieces. We know this stuff. The relevance for this audience and for our group is very much that we have a real responsibility because what we do shapes behavior for a long time to come. And when I was doing the research for this presentation, what really shocked me was just how long-lived some of our decisions are. So when it's around planning and infrastructure and the buildings that we build, the way that we design our urban form and where we live, these are decisions that can hang around for centuries. So we have a legacy that's actually quite very long, and we have to be very mindful of every decision that we make today. We are locking in a particular way of doing things. As the COVID-19 pandemic hit, I think there was quite a bit of energy and optimism that we would find a new pathway for doing things, a different way of economics, politics, and policymaking. I think that's probably pushing it too far, but there are lots of lessons in terms of things that we were able to do with COVID. The response to COVID has been very different across different parts of the world. But in New Zealand, what we've seen is that there are lots of good lessons in that we can tackle some pretty big issues if we put our mind to it, if we listen to the science, if we take people along with us. But we've also had lots of gaps, which shows that policymaking and change making is actually really hard to do. For me, some of the sort of really key messages that came through first was that we make choices. Now, when we look around the world, we can see everybody's doing something slightly different when it comes to the pandemic. Now, that's not surprising because it's brand new, right? In many ways, we haven't dealt with something like this in a century. So we are seeing every country trying to grapple with how do we deal with this quite new problem. And we're seeing quite different ways of different approaches and choices being made. But where there has been success, the common element has been very much about collective action, because the virus is very much about not having control. You don't get to choose whether you get infected or not. If everybody pulls together, then the outcome is better. And that is true of a lot of public policy, particularly on things like climate change. We really have to work together because quite often there will be a winner and a loser, at least in the short term. And if we're not all willing to lose a little bit, then it's very difficult for us to make changes. One of the things that also came through for me was it's fine to have individual responsibility, but it's also important to have government direction and a binding direction so that we do not do things that are harmful. So minimizing harm is extraordinarily important. And so when it comes to policymaking, one of the things that we always talk about in economics is use price as a strong signal. So whether it's when it's possible, make sure that you are able to stop people from doing things they shouldn't do. And where pricing doesn't work, where it's really quite harmful, make sure you use regulation or directive to stop that stuff from happening. And we saw that again with the pandemic, right? We're in lockdown again. That's very much a regulatory directive kind of approach, which is telling you don't do this, because if you do, there's going to be this very negative outcome for all of society. But we also found that if you're not monitoring your approach and enforcing your rules and regulations and your strategy, then it's not going to work. Again, I think that came through the response that we've had so far. Now, whether you agree or not, we know that there has been weaknesses in our approach so far, particularly at the border. And so monitoring and enforcement of any policy is extraordinarily important. Now, it's been hard to do this last one with the pandemic, but we want to incentivize good behavior. In a way, New Zealand actually went through that kind of relatively euphoric 3 months when we came out of the initial lockdowns and we were in pretty unconstrained kind of environment. And we saw this extraordinary amount of spending, investment, you name it. The economy really rebounded. And I think that was very much the reward, that what we were experiencing in New Zealand was very different from the rest of the world. And so as long as there are rewards and those reptilian responses that we get, so if we're getting that reward of doing the right thing and we're being, I guess, punished or not doing those bad things, we're slowly heading in the right direction. The other thing that really came through for me in the COVID-19 pandemic is just the importance of education and communication. Now, pretty much everybody around the world is now an expert on infectious diseases, right? We're all talking about R0s and transmission rates and those kinds of things. But that's actually really good and important because we're talking a common language. It's really, really important that everybody is on at least a similar platform to be able to have those conversations. Now, you won't be able to take everybody with you, but it's important that we get a large majority of people at least agreeing on the science, agreeing on the approach, understanding the boundaries, understanding all of that stuff. And what that means in translation is that the key thing that drives change is politics. And despite a lot of the political bickering and whatnot we might have seen in the last little while, in reality, the broad approach has had pretty strong consensus. And that has meant that we have been able to pursue the policies to control COVID-19 quite well and quite successfully in New Zealand. And the community has gone along with it. So it's hard for me to know where we made the change first, whether it was community or whether it was the politics. I think it's more around a common understanding and a common base. So that's really quite helpful. And it felt to me like when I talked to my clients and friends and family around the world, New Zealand was a little bit different in that we were much more compliant and much more willing to do this for each other. And that's good because we can build on that when it comes to things like climate change, because it is going to require a huge amount of working with each other if we want to make the change that we want. So again, those of you who were on the presentation last time, you would have seen something like the chart that's on the left-hand side. And that's the donut from Kate Meyer. If any of you haven't read Donut Economics, at least go and have a look at the write-up she did on the World Economic Forum, or if you've got the time and inclination, read her book. It's really quite an excellent way to think about the economy. And essentially what she's saying is the economy, there's a purpose of the economy, right? It's not about growing the economy for the sake of it. It's about creating those better social foundations, but also at the same time making sure we stay within the limits of the planet. And whether it's around climate change, whether it's around nitrogen, whether it's around land, whether it's biodiversity, all of these things are really important. And there's a whole bunch of these natural planetary limits that we're now breaching. So I think there is this strange situation where we've had extraordinary economic growth over the course of the last 40 years. But during that time, New Zealand has had almost no improvement when it comes to things like inequality. If anything, we've seen worsening levels of poverty in certain segments of society. We've seen worsening housing affordability. We've seen a neglect of our infrastructure. So there's been all these other bits that are somehow quite strange. So when we talk about economics, I think it's important that we reframe it away from a conversation about growth to reframing the economy as something that's actually for us. It's about society and humanity, and it is about the interactions that we have with each other, but it needs to happen within some broader limits. And if we don't, what we're going to find is our quality of life is going to get worse and worse over time. I really like this cartoon on the right-hand side because, right now everybody's so focused on COVID-19. We're going to be spending billions and billions of dollars and a huge amount of political capital and policy effort to try and deal with it. But in this particular chart, it's essentially that bump, that purple bump that's in the front. And, we're choosing between the purple bump and the blue bump, right? Whether, how big is the infection going to be? But what's coming down the pipe for us is climate change, and that's way bigger. And when it comes to climate change, what we've seen is a lot of commitments and a lot of broken promises. Whether it's the Kyoto Protocol or the Rio or the Paris Agreement, there are agreements, but we're still not seeing enough action. So in many ways, I think what we're seeing with the pandemic is that this is really quite big. It's going to have a huge impact on all of us. But in the context of climate change, this is actually really small. And if anything, as climate change accelerates, we're going to probably experience more natural hazards, more natural disasters, more pandemics, and all of those bits and pieces. So we got to keep things in context and think about if we're able to make these really quite big sacrifices and policy responses in response to COVID-19, we must have it in our reserves somewhere to be also be able to respond to the challenge of climate change that's coming. And I don't want to diminish the human and economic cost that this pandemic is going to have, right? Already we've lost many lives. It could have been much worse in New Zealand, but around the world we're seeing, hundreds of thousands of people die of COVID-19, preventable deaths, right? In New Zealand, we've seen an extraordinary increase in unemployment. I was looking at the numbers quite recently when they came out. These numbers come out every Friday. And you can see the blue line on the left-hand chart. It's kind of going up like a rocket ship. Very unusual for us to lose so many jobs in such a short period of time. When the pandemic first hit and we had the restrictions, we had the changes in behavior, there was this massive shock to the economy. And what we saw was, in the space of about 6 months, we lost over 60,000 jobs. Now, the context is in the entire global financial crisis, the last recession, we lost 80,000 jobs over a period of 18 months, a year and a half. Recessions normally unfold over quarters and years, not weeks and months. Whereas this time around, we've seen this extraordinary shock that has really had quite a big impact on a lot of people's lives and livelihoods. But the response has also been extraordinary, right? Whether it's around interest rates being extraordinarily low, or whether it's about what the government has done. So on the right-hand side, you can see that the government is going to essentially borrow something like 30% of GDP. So the amount of debt that New Zealand's going to have is going to be the kinds of highs that we had last seen in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, that really is quite big. I don't think it's particularly frightening. It's very manageable for a country like New Zealand, but it shows you that we are willing to spend a huge amount of our collective resources to protect businesses, protect lives, and protect livelihoods. So we have it in us to respond to shocks, and we have the resources to be able to do this. So when people tell me that, we couldn't possibly deal with climate change or water quality or biodiversity because it would cost too much, you show them what's happening right now. You go, well, actually, when there is consensus, we are absolutely able to respond when we want to. And I think that's a really important lesson and something that we need to keep using as our base for how we approach the next years and decades to come. So these were the big lessons for me from the pandemic. And, I've been kind of working on this pandemic related stuff pretty much since the middle of February. Remember when it was mainly a thing in Wuhan? It was an issue for China. We were really worried about tourism from China. Now we're not even talking about flights anymore, right? So the world has changed a lot. But what was really clear at the time, it felt very abstract. And we can't imagine new things very well, right? Because it feels somehow different and alien. It's very difficult for us to respond to that stuff. And a lot of the conversation we're seeing right now, even now, is we must open things up because my business is going to suffer lower sales or whatever. Losing sight of the fact that if we don't get on top of the health response, your sales are going to be even worse for a longer period of time. So somehow we have the myopia that is so common in humanity. So this is not about judging people, it's about understanding the frailties of humanity, that our behaviors, the way that our brain works is very much designed towards prioritizing the short term over the long term, which really works against any kind of response when it comes to climate change. So, a little bit of a sidebar, but those of you who haven't read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, great book. You can just read the introduction. I think that's probably enough. You'll get enough out of it. But that, I think, really kind of unveils a lot of the frailties that each of us have as a biological function. We are designed to have these these foibles. And as a result, education and communication is really, really important. In a bit, I'll talk about smoking and the smoking cessation program in New Zealand. So because we've brought up 30 years, in my mind, that's been a great success. It shows that given enough education, communication, all the tools that go with it, we can make genuine progress over a long period of time, but you have to sustain it over a long period of time. And education and communication has been a really big part. I don't know about you, but I listened to the briefings and all that kind of stuff. I had never before observed how journalists ask questions of politicians. So it's been quite an enlightening period for me to understand how the sausage is made. But also it has meant that we are having a much greater understanding of all the kind of issues that are kind of framing the current environment when it comes to the response to the pandemic. And that, I think, has been really quite important. We also were dealing with some very stark trade-offs, right? So, it's not very often where we're literally dealing with life and death. And I think it was much more visible because we saw it happening in other places, right? The terrible sights of overwhelmed hospitals and morgues in places like Italy and the US and the UK, really quite gut-wrenching stuff. But I think that made it very real for a lot of people. So that there was that kind of that shock for us to do stuff. And so there was that kind of, we could see what the collective response might be, because it might be you, it might be your parents, it might be your friends who might catch the virus and suffer those consequences. So the collective action that we took in New Zealand, certainly the success of the first lockdown was very much that we complied so well that we were able to enjoy 3 months of pretty much unfettered economic activity with the exception of the border. And by my numbers, our economy cumulatively was better off than places like Sweden by about $6 billion. So this is big stuff. But also initially there was pretty broad support. Now those things are going to diminish over time. So you really have to find that spark and the time to be able to implement the changes. When the consensus is there, when the permission is there, we have to strike while it's hot. The difference, of course, is that the pandemic, even though it's going to feel like it's a bit of a drag and a bit of a long drawn-out thing, really it's going to be over in 2 or 3 years. We're going to get some sort of, we're going to get better treatments. We're going to get some sort of vaccine. We're going to learn somehow to live with it better and not kill a whole bunch of people along the way. So this is going to be, I think, quite a different thing to what we need to do with climate change. Because when it comes to climate change, we're talking about a permanent change in behavior, a permanent change in the way we do things, a permanent change in the makeup of our built environment, our policy making, our politics. So this is really quite a lot harder and bigger than what we might have experienced over the course of the last few weeks and few months. Now, this is the task that's ahead of us, right? So, this is kind of like the 1,000-year trajectory of the CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. And, it's been that straight line up is not surprising, because at the same time, what we saw was that incredible globalization, incredible increase in prosperity, consumption, production, industrialization, all of those things happen at the same time. So if you overlay a chart of GDP or industrial activity or transport, everything has done the same thing in terms of this almost rocket ship. And it has had huge amounts of positives, right? We've got massive reduction in poverty and all those kinds of things, but we can't keep killing the planet. And what was really striking was over the course of the pandemic, over the course of this year, you can see on the right-hand side, there was a significant reduction in daily emissions across the global economy. Now, while that was the case, look at what's required in the gray dotted line over the course of the next 10 years. So we need, not only do we have to achieve what we achieved in the last 6 months, we have to keep doing this every year for 10 years if you want to stay within the planetary limits when it comes to carbon emissions. So the task is really quite big. And I think we need to be mindful that this is not something that will be tackled easily. You've seen how much response there has been, how much hurt and anger there is with the loss of businesses, loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods. This is something that's going to be very hard to achieve very quickly because the task ahead is really very big. Now, for me, there was a whole bunch of lessons from smoking cessation program in New Zealand, and I was really looking into it because, you know, we've had 30 years of this policy effort, and I wanted to have a look at what were the kinds of things that they used that were so successful, and also things that were not successful. The one big one was that they really used all the tools that were available to them. And I think that's important. We can't rely on just one thing. You've got to do everything in your arsenal, because the reality is that this is going to be a marathon. You're going to have to change behavior, and you're going to have to stick to it over a long period of time, because we need that sustained change in behavior. And the first thing that really happened was, you know, we've seen the massive increase in the cost of ciggies, right? And that was important because that sends a very strong signal and an economic signal for people to not smoke. But also we know that what has happened was that funding was able to be used for things like helping people to quit, and that was spread across multiple agencies. And rather than being centralized, making sure that it went across lots of community groups and targeted areas was really quite important. Again, not a 100% success, but certainly that approach of being quite diffuse and dealing with every part of community, I think is something that's really important, because we need to take everybody along and reach all those hard to convince and hard to change communities. Otherwise, you're not going to get the sustained change. And there's always that lurking fear that if you turn your back, all the wins that we've made, all the policy changes we've made might be undone by the next government or the next local government or whatever it might be. Education and communication was a really big part, right? I mean, it was really quite interesting to see, you know, just the shift in people's behavior, but also people's understanding of what smoking does. So we went from denial to understanding. So the knowledge was really quite important. And the communication has also led to a culture change. And that culture change is really quite important. At last count, about 80% plus of the New Zealand population disapproved of smoking. So, you know, think back to the 1960s and 70s when over a third of New Zealanders were smoking, compared to now when it's, you know, less than 15%. And that's really quite a big impact. And also what we saw was that when it came to smoking, it was non-partisan. So across the political spectrum, everybody was driving towards the same goal. And that was really important because we were able to build on the successes year in, year out, because you can't let up. The thing is, changing people's behavior takes time, and we want those changes to be really enduring. Otherwise, a lot of those gains can be lost really quickly. So, you know, I think for me, there is a whole bunch of lessons that are really quite important, and there's some there's a lot of relevance for us in that, although those of us who are involved in the built environment, because the way that we design our places has big implications, both in terms of the emissions that we make because we might be traveling big distances because everything is far flung, or because the things that we're doing now are going to be locking us into a way of life for a long time to come. Now, I found this in a New Plymouth District Council presentation document, and I thought it was really useful to kind of think about it in these timeframes. And you know, they were really looking at what's the kind of estimated useful life of built environment components. And you look at things like flood protection and water infrastructure and roading and buildings and improvements. You know, more often than not, we're talking about decisions that are going to be around with us for 50 or 100 or 150 years. So when we make these decisions, when we have changed the urban form, this is going to be with us for a long time to come. This is not the case when it comes to things like vehicles or computer software or other things. Those things are moving around really quickly, so we can change those things fast. But we are in a unique position where the decisions that we make today are going to have a very long legacy. And I think that really comes through when you look at our housing stock. So 50% of the housing stock in New Zealand was built before I was born. So, a lot of the houses that we have been around for a hell of a long time. And some of them have been around for more than 100 years. And we need to understand that the things that we do are going to affect not just us, but for many generations to come. And we need to think about what would they want in the environment and the urban form that we are creating with our choices. Now, I think one of the big things that's really going to shift things is politics. And politics is shifting a lot. This is a slightly awkward diagram, but what I wanted to show you was the size of cohorts, generational cohorts over time, and how important they are when it comes to voting and their impact on politics. So baby boomers have literally been the dominant voice of politics pretty much since the mid-1970s. And this is probably going to be the last election where they kind of hold sway. From now on, things will become much more diffuse. So we're not going to have that big block of one generation that's going to dominate things. And that, I think, presents a really big opportunity, because not because boomers suck, but just because, the way we grew up, are the values and our understanding of how the world works, how the environment works, and all those kinds of things are hard to let go. There's a lot of baggage. Whereas with younger generations, I think the reality of climate change and the reality of the consequences are far more real. And we're going to find a more fertile ground for changes that are coming in the future. So I think this election is a little bit of a whatever, because it's all about the pandemic. But as we look forward to the next one and the one after that, I think we're going to find some pretty big shifts taking place, because not only will we see the voter profile change, but we're also going to see the people who are in power and people in government that are going to change. So what do we do? I've rambled on a lot, and I wanted to bring you all to this. The main thing that I wanted to talk about today was, well, we know that something has to change, but what is it and how do we do it? We know the what. We know what to do. We know the policy tools that we can use. We know that we can use carbon pricing. We can use regulatory minimums. We can do lots of things. And I'll come back to that. But so far, we have not done them because the political will hasn't been there. The ultimate goal is actually not around those changes in policy. It's actually around changing social norms. It's around changing the political views across the spectrum, because that's the only way we get the enduring and sustained change that we need. So just like we saw with smoking cessation, it's really important we pull out all the stops, use all the tools that are available to us, but we need to keep at it for many, many years to come. So how do we do it? I think there is an individual perspective and there is a collective perspective. The collective, in some ways, is very easy. That's where economists can have quite a big role to play, right? We can help design the policies around how do we price the externalities, the costs of what we're doing, the things that we're not counting, the emissions, the pollution, the social consequences of poverty, of overcrowding, unaffordable housing, whatever it might be. We can help design regulations to make sure we absolutely do not allow bad things to happen. So it might be around redesigning the building code, make sure that we don't build shit houses. I think that's a good start. Or the way that we prioritize our infrastructure, make sure that it gives full credence to our carbon zero promises. We can design the monitoring and enforcement. We can do the incentives and all those kinds of things. But when it comes to us as individuals, I think the thing that's really going to matter is around those last 2 points on my collective list, which is around communication and education. We need to all be on the same page in terms of what is happening and what are the consequences of not doing the right thing. And we need to align those messages with our values, because we need to internalize what we want to do. Otherwise, it's always going to be hard for us to give up the things that we find are really comfortable and easy to do right now. Now, I don't think it's going to make a hell of a difference if we recycle a bit more or spend a little bit less, because collectively, individually, that's good, and we should do that. But ultimately, the big gains are going to be in collective change, because we need lots of people to make the change, and we need to do that quickly if we're able to make that change. I think what we can do individually is, yes, do those things, but we can start to have a bit more impact if we can change the way that we think and understand these issues in our workplaces. So I think there are two things. One is having those conversations with our peers and colleagues, and making sure people are on the same page, that education and communication is extraordinarily important. But if you're in that built environment, there is a real role to play in terms of doing things differently, because if we build differently, if we build smarter, if we build better, that will have a lasting legacy. So it may not feel like much, but it is better than the alternative. I think influencing our industry body is probably bigger, and influencing your local minister is probably more important. And let me explain why. We've got an election that's coming up. How many of you have actually spoken to your local MP or the candidates that are there? Most of us don't. And yet they are going to be there representing your views. So making sure that we engage in democracy is really, really important, because ultimately the people who are going to make those decisions are very much those guys, right? The people we install in positions of power. So we may not be able to choose exactly the policies that they implement, but we can choose the people who have the same values as we do. And so without talking to them, without engaging with them, without connecting with them, it doesn't have to be face to face, but you've got to get a good feel for what are the representatives, your democratic representatives, really doing when it comes to climate change or whatever other issues that you might have. That, I think, is probably the biggest individual thing that we can do that will have long-lasting effect. Because what we're going to see is, if we're able to get across the political spectrum sufficient buy-in so that we pursue climate change as a sustainable and enduring policy shift, we are going to see the change come through. That is the lesson from what we have seen so far in COVID, and certainly the lesson that we have seen from smoking cessation. And we are going to see those changes, but my fear is right now there is still far too much division across our political spectrum that we're going to see that flip-flopping of policies that is not going to be very helpful. So, doing a full circle, what we started with is we are not living within our planetary limits. The urban form has a really important role to play because it contributes to a lot of that carbon emissions and environmental degradation, but also the decisions that we make today are going to be long lasting, and if we make the right decisions, we are going to be moving towards the right pathways. I think there are two approaches to making that happen. One is the individual and the other is the collective. The collective is hard to do without doing the individual, because that's where you and I have control. Our jobs, whether it's this election or the period in between or the next election, is making sure we influence our politicians across the political spectrum. It doesn't matter what your political views are, go and engage. Make sure that they understand there is a role to play. There is a role for politicians, and your views are very much that we want to make this change. We can. We know that New Zealand can do it, as long as we take everybody with it and we have the right regulatory mechanisms. So with that, I think what we'll do is I'll stop talking and open up for some questions and conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Shamubeel. Your comments around kind of understanding those levers about what we can actually do as individuals rather than focusing on the issue is really empowering. Now we've got quite a few questions that we've got to put to you. And the first one relates back to, you mentioned kind of in COVID, we had a common base understanding and the right politics, which meant we were pretty happy to comply with what was asked, which was pretty extreme, and still is. So does this come down to leadership? How important is strong leadership to get that kind of consensus and permission to kind of make strong decisions?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And let me answer it in two ways. And you can either do a top-down or you can do a diffuse bottom-up. I think both are perfectly legitimate ways of doing things. I think it's been unusual for New Zealand to have such a charismatic communicator in a leader as we have had in Jacinda. This is not normal for politics. So I don't think we should expect that we're going to have another leader who's going to come along for a period of, say, another 20 or 30 years, which is the time frame that we're looking at, to drive us towards that sustained change when it comes to climate change. So instead, I think what we're talking about is, how do we make sure that all the political parties or at least majority of the political parties, are coming from the same understanding and the same values and same goals. Because if we can shift the dial, that is probably far more successful than trying to pin it all on one great leader. So yes, communication and leadership is important, but I think much more important is the consensus. So it requires both, but really hard to get that. What we have seen right in the last few months is that having that very strong leader that were a good communicator is helpful. But there are also other countries that have done really well without the same kind of leadership. So there are different ways of achieving the same outcome.
Shamubeel, one of the big themes through there is about this idea of the short-term thinking, or you call the lizard brain. We're evolved to make these short-term kind of choices applied to these long-term consequences, which everyone, at least in construction in our industry, can certainly kind of relate to. This sort of feels like it's led us to a situation where the thing that we need, which is very, very big moves quite quickly, is the exact thing we're sort of afraid of economically. And you talked at the beginning of one of those shocks affecting us right now. Should we be that afraid of that shock coming? Or how can we learn to perhaps embrace the inevitable if that's actually what's required?
Yeah, I think the reality of what we have experienced is that there are no free lunches. So if you want to make these big changes, there will be casualties, because there must be. We have to stop doing things as they are. It's kind of, it's obvious, right? It's a given that you're going to break a lot of what you have now to be able to do things differently. So the question is, do we not break anything and keep doing things the same way? Or do we break things and we provide help and support and all of that stuff around it? Which is kind of where I think a lot of New Zealanders, particularly those with grey hair, will remember the late 80s and early 90s didn't work out so well. We made those big changes, but at the same time, we took away the safety nets. It was a really brutal period for many New Zealanders. So yes, we needed to make those changes. A lot of those changes were actually good for New Zealand, but at the same time, we created this long tail of misery, which I think lost a lot of trust in government and policymakers. So all I'm saying is there is no costless way of making this change. So if we are serious about making this change, we will have to make some tough decisions, but those tough decisions need to come with some way of helping those who are going to be very badly hurt.
So do you think there are some kind of foundation ideas or values that we need to lose that are holding us back from embarking on that kind of journey of what might be coming?
I mean, I think the answer is a bit trite. And the answer is yes. I think we're going to have to let go of our lizard brain, right? I think we want to have it all. We want to live comfortably now. We want our life to be exactly the way it is now, and at the same time save the planet. We can't do both. We have to consume less. We have to live differently. We have to build differently. You got to make change. Otherwise, we're not going to get the same outcomes. The challenge, of course, is that we are asking ourselves to think in a way that's not natural to us, thinking long term. If we want to prioritize the future of our children and our grandchildren, then of course we would behave very differently. But when it comes to filling up your car or getting in the car to go for a 3-hour drive, you're not thinking about your grandkids that you don't have yet. And so it's really hard to do that. And that's why we need those regulations and pricing mechanisms, because they work, because you don't have to actively think to make those decisions. So I don't think we can rely on individuals to make active decisions. And that's why it's really important, like I said before, we got to pull out all the stops, use all the tools in our arsenal to be able to change people's behavior. Because left to our own devices, we're not going to do what's right.
We've had an interesting question come through. Sorry, Arch, interrupted you. In terms of kind of that collective thinking, should we be looking at Oceania as the collective and not just our borders?
Well, I mean, I think when it comes to climate change, there is no such thing as borders, right? It's affecting everybody, and certainly our neighbors in the Pacific are going to be very badly affected. But for us, I think it's also an opportunity, right? because there is this incredible resource of people and talent and humanity that we can use to, well, that we can nurture for New Zealand to, I guess, cope with and deal with what's coming. So yes, I think ultimately, if you take the collective analogy far enough, the response has to be global, right? And I think that's always been the big pushback, that what's the point of doing something when New Zealand is a fraction of global emissions? What's the point of changing things here, because you won't change the behavior of all the other big polluters in other big countries? So taken to its extreme, that's where the collective action, I think, leads, that there has to be a global leadership. I'm still hopeful that it's going to come, and I'm probably being naive, but despite the failure of Kyoto and other things to make those sustained changes, the reality is we've made steps in the right direction. And with each year, we seem to be getting closer and closer towards at least some kind of a common agenda, if not commitments and actions. So it's the last bit that's always been missing, and that's where the politics is really holding us back. And I think it's really that the collectivism is really going to come from that consensus when it comes to politics, that it shouldn't be a political view to be, climate change shouldn't be the place where we have politics, just like it's not when it comes to smoking, right? Nobody thinks smoking is a good idea. And I think that's where we need to get to when it comes to climate change as well.
Shamubeel, it was interesting that the one of the final slides is that the goal was, what did I write down? Not necessarily that the goal was the addressing of the climate change issues, but the goal was around changing social norms and political views. And I just wonder if, in your mind, and using the smoking example, does that almost happen halfway through or early on in the process as a really, really key tool? And then wider social pressures and things actually help deliver on the rest of it. So you talk about strong incentives and disincentives because we're all terrible people and we'll all do the wrong things with our short-term thinking and the frailty of humanity. So those incentives set something up. Is there a tipping point where those behaviours become so unacceptable that other things kick in and help them really gain speed?
Yeah, I mean, it's the chicken and egg of social norms, right? How do you create social change in culture, right? Because that's really what we're talking about. And I think when it comes to culture, the big changes come from understanding. So a common understanding is really important. So if you're all coming from the same base of understanding what climate change is and what the impact is, and if we can make sure that we kind of educate and really reach out to those people who are still in denial, right? I was at a conference recently when somebody came up to me and said, "Your presentation was great, but that slide on climate change, that was a bit shit." And you're like, I'm not going to have this conversation with the denialists because I just don't have the energy, but somebody sure took to you. And I think, that was my I just didn't have the energy, but that's what all of us have to also take on. For those of us who are converted, we have to try and, talk to the people with respect, with dignity about what their beliefs are, because we're seeing that with the pandemic right now, right? So much misinformation, and we're starting to see those divisions really come through. And that to me is really frightening, because if we become divided, then our public health response is going to be very weak. So I'm repeating myself, but I think I don't know exactly how we create that that change in culture, other than it requires an understanding, and it is a groundswell that's building. And it's about us pushing along that momentum and building on it as much as possible. And I think a lot of that is what we can do individually. How do we amplify that movement? How do we, how do we convert one more person? Because the more that it's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like a missionary zeal, right? We have to convert as many people as possible to our cause, because it's about the future of humanity and the future of our planet.
Mm.
One of the ones we talked about and didn't touch on here, but it's hinted at. It's easy to think that what's been advocated is shrinkage, but you talked when before we set this talk up about the difference between kind of growth versus recovering that through productivity, and I wonder if that might be a good thing to just briefly mention and lay out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this kind of view that we must shrink everything for our economic footprint or our climate footprint to reduce. Well, not all of our activity has a high impact. So finding efficiencies on those areas, doing less of those things is important. I think ultimately it's around how do we maximize what makes us happy, right? So one of the things that always comes through for me is when we do those surveys of well-being, that after a certain point in time, certain point of income, those additional dollars really aren't making you much happier. You're just spending a lot more money on stuff that doesn't make you happy, right? I'm going to go very Marie Kondo, right? And go, if it's not going to spark joy, don't buy that stuff. So we can do a little bit of that. So yes, you're right in that there is a little bit of reducing of the consumption that's important, but there's also quite a lot of the change that's going to come is around productivity gains. Not everything requires more inputs. So if you think about what's happening in the stock market right now, most of that growth in the record growth in the stock market is not about us producing more stuff. It's all about software and about things that are weightless. And then they're not having quite the same impact as traditional economic growth, which is about more oil, more resources, and more products. So I think there is an alternative where we can still become more prosperous, but we can find a way that is going to be less destructive for the planet. But the current model doesn't fit that. So there is the transition is going to be very painful, right? So we've seen that in places like Taranaki, when you turn off the exploration, it is going to have a devastating impact because you've just turned something off and something doesn't replace it straight away.
Got two more questions, Shamubeel. We talked earlier about kind of having a collective understanding and will to change. And for me, I think one of the most powerful ways of doing that is having a shared vision that people can really buy into. So the question for you is, what does an economy that's green, resilient, fair kind of look like in 2030 or 2050?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think the economy is kind of the wrong lens for that. The economy is there to create well-being for us, right? It's the tool, not the thing. And so if you think about what is it that gives us a fair, resilient economy in 2030 or 2040, whatever it might be, it's those boundaries that we set for ourselves, right? So not doing things that are bad for the planet is a really good start. And not being destructive is a really good start. So at the moment, what we do is we put no cost on doing bad things, right? So in many ways, a lot of our economic behavior when it comes to climate, if it was a criminal matter, we would all be in prison, right? Because we're doing things that are vandalizing the planet. So in many ways, I think if I had a vision for the economy that was delivering on the goal that you're talking about, it would be around making sure that we pay the right price for the things that we do. And that's also about the things that we measure and the things that we don't measure. And this is a conversation Arch and I had, and I think one that's really important is at the moment, there's lots of things that are not priced, measured, and changed. So things like carbon emissions, things like our impact on society, these are all things that we just don't count. And so it's not enough frame of thinking. But in an economy that is fair and resilient, it has to count those things because then you are not doing the things that are bad for you. So I think a lot of it's around transparency and taking our veil off. I think a lot of it's around taking our veil off and not thinking the economy is just the things that we measure now or we think are of benefit to us individually. We have to make explicit all those costs that we're imposing on future generations and on others.
What about localization versus globalization, kind of in that scenario?
I mean, in many ways, I think globalization has a lot of benefit, right? Because, for example, if you think about things like food production, New Zealand's really good at food production. So when people talk about even our dairy sector is far less intensive than many of our competitors. So globalization means that it can play a big part in reducing our global carbon footprint. So, specialization still matters. Places that are good at it, it really matters. But at the same time, there is also a very strong role for localization in that, there is no reason why you shouldn't buy something that's local, that hasn't traveled through a plane, like bringing courgettes to you from Queensland in the middle of winter is not a great idea, right? So there's some things that are just stupid because we don't price carbon. And, people aren't buying courgettes right now because they're like $30 a kilo, but, that's the price it should be every time it comes over from Queensland, right? Because It shouldn't be coming via a plane to your plate. So my view is that there is a role for all of those kinds of things, but I think we can make quite active choices, but we would make those choices better if the costs that are currently not explicit were made explicit.
Thank you. It's great. So our closing question, you talked about the role of the individual and the collective. So what's one action or idea that you'd like all of our listeners to take away today?
Well, I mean, we've got an election coming up, so let's go with that one. Go and talk to your MP or understand who your local representatives are or candidates are. Because the best thing you can do in the coming election is to make sure you have a representative in Wellington who represents your values. And whatever those values are, make sure they're aligned, because the reality is that we may not be able to influence all the things they do in government, but at least you will have someone in government who thinks and has values like you do.
That's great, thank you.
I think that's a fantastic kind of message to end on. I'd love to think everyone on the call immediately gets off, hits the white pages. We were talking about that earlier. Shamubeel calls the MP. So, however you vote, get out and vote and engage in democracy and make those views known. Thank you so much for joining us on the second talk tonight, Shamubeel. It's an absolute pleasure. To those watching, we will be capturing tonight, videoing it and sharing it shortly, and stay tuned to our feeds for news about the next speaker in the next talk. So thank you very much, Shamubeel. Thank you everyone for joining, and Paul Maria.
Thanks everyone.